There is a particular kind of opening episode that grabs you not with spectacle, but with quiet humiliation. And that is exactly the kind of opening that monster, Terikat Dengan Devi, chooses to build its entire foundation on. The camera does not start with a battle. It does not start with a prophecy thundering across a cosmic void or a god descending from a golden throne. It starts with a young man at the bottom. Luke Wayne, standing in the middle of Asgard Academy, like someone who wandered into the wrong story, absorbing the kind of looks from his peers that make your stomach twist even though you are watching from the safety of a screen. And look, if you are brand new to this world and you just clicked on this video, wondering whether this show is worth your time, welcome to Flick Flare. I'm glad you are here, and I am going to be completely honest with you from the jump. This drama surprised me in ways I did not expect, and I want to walk you through exactly why. Spoilers are fully on the table today. We are going deep, no tiptoeing. So if you want to go in fresh, bookmark this, come back, and then we can scream about it together in the comments. Let me talk about Asgard Academy for a moment, because the world building here is doing something that I think a lot of fantasy dramas attempt, but very few actually pull off with this level of confidence. The setting is not just a backdrop for training montages and teenage rivalries. It is a pressure cooker. It is a hierarchy encoded into the architecture itself. And you feel it in the way the show frames its spaces. The high-ranking students occupy sunlit corridors with vaulted ceilings that practically glow with divine energy. And then there are the spaces where Luke exists, the lower tiers, the dimmer halls, the places where the stone feels heavier and the light does not quite reach. The production design team understood the assignment on a molecular level because they did not just build a school, they built a social structure you can walk through. And that distinction matters enormously in a show like this, where the protagonist's entire arc begins with a feeling of not belonging. Luke Wayne as a character is interesting because the show makes a deliberate choice in those early scenes that I think a lot of people might overlook. He is not just the typical underdog who grits his teeth and vows to prove everyone wrong. There is a resignation in him. You can see it in the way he carries his shoulders, the way he does not fight back when someone mocks his ranking, the way his eyes sort of glaze over during combat assessments like he has already accepted the verdict before the match even begins. And that is a bold choice for a lead because you're asking the audience to invest in someone who, at least on the surface, does not seem to believe in himself. The show is betting that you will find something compelling in that vulnerability, and I think it pays off. But it also means the early episodes require a certain patience that rewards you enormously later on. The Academy itself operates on a soul ranking system, and I want to break this down for anyone who has not encountered this kind of mechanic before because it is central to understanding everything that follows. Essentially, every student at Asgard Academy is evaluated based on the quality and potency of their soul energy, their ability to channel divine or elemental forces, and their combat effectiveness. The rankings are not just numbers on a board. They determine your access to resources, your mentor assignments, your social standing, and ultimately your future in this world's power structure. Luke sits near the bottom of the system, not because he lacks potential in some abstract destined way, but because his soul energy signature reads as fundamentally incompatible with the Academy's conventional training methods. The system literally cannot categorize him, and rather than seeing that as extraordinary, the institution treats it as deficient. There's a whole commentary embedded in that about how systems of measurement often fail the very people they are supposed to serve, and the show is smart enough to let that theme breathe without hammering you over the head with it. Now here is where the story takes its first major turn. And it is a turn that redefines the entire trajectory of the show. Luke discovers, through what I would describe as one of the most visually striking sequences in the early episodes, a forbidden soul mark. The way this scene is constructed deserves real praise because it does not happen in a training arena or a library or any of the expected places. Luke is isolated at what might be his lowest emotional point, and the mark manifests not as a triumphant awakening, but as something that feels almost parasitic at first. There is a genuine eeriness to it. The visual effects team gives this mark a living quality, like it is breathing beneath his skin, and the sound design in this moment is so unsettling, this low thrumming that vibrates in your chest. And you are not sure if you should be excited for Luke or terrified for him. The show holds you in that ambiguity deliberately, and it is a masterful bit of tonal control. The Forbidden Soul mark gives Luke an ability that nobody in this world has seen in centuries. The power to bind female creatures through contracts. Now, I need to address something directly because I know the premise might trigger certain assumptions. Yes, this is a harem adjacent setup. Yes, there are multiple women who become central to Luke's journey. And yes, the show is operating in a genre space that has a reputation for shallow wish fulfillment. But here is what I think elevates Monster. Terikat Dengan Devi above the typical execution of this concept. The contracts are not just a power mechanic. They are relationship mechanics. Every binding that Luke forms is built on a foundation of mutual need, genuine emotional negotiation, and a kind of vulnerability that requires both parties to lower their defenses in ways that are uncomfortable and real. The show treats these bonds not as trophies, but as partnerships. And that distinction changes everything about how the story lands. The first woman Luke binds is a creature who, in any other version of this story, would have been reduced to a visual design and a one-note personality. But the writing gives her interiority. She has her own reasons for accepting the contract that have nothing to do with Luke's journey and everything to do with her own survival, her own history, her own wounds. And watching Luke have to reckon with the fact that this bond is not about him, that it requires him to show up for someone else's story as much as his own. That is where the show starts to reveal its emotional intelligence. Their early interactions are awkward and mistrustful in the best possible way. There is a scene where she tests the limits of the contract by deliberately disobeying a command, and the look on Luke's face shifts from frustration to curiosity to a kind of respect that he was not planning to feel. That micro-expression work, by the way, is one of the show's quiet superpowers. The camera lingers on faces in moments that other shows would cut away from, and it trusts the actors to carry entire emotional arcs through the smallest shifts in their eyes. I want to linger on the performance of whoever is playing Luke Wayne because I think it is the kind of work that does not always get the recognition it deserves in these kinds of shows. He's doing something very specific with his physicality in the early episodes that I think is incredibly disciplined. Luke moves like someone who is trying to take up less space. He angels his body away from confrontation. He flinches almost imperceptibly when someone raises their voice near him, and his smile, when it appears, looks like something he had to practice. That is not easy to sustain across multiple episodes without it becoming repetitive or one-dimensional. But this actor finds variation within that constrained register. You see the cracks in the performance, moments where Luke's natural fire pokes through the shell of compliance, and those moments hit harder because of how carefully the baseline has been established. It is like watching a pressure gauge that you know is going to eventually redline, and the show is brilliant enough to make you wait for it. The relationship between Luke and his first bound partner begins to develop through these small, incremental moments that accumulate into something genuinely affecting. There is a training sequence in the middle episodes that I keep coming back to because it does something that most training sequences in fantasy dramas do not bother to do. It shows failure as collaborative. Luke and this woman are trying to synchronize their abilities for the first time, and it does not work. It does not work in an embarrassing, public way with other students watching and laughing, and you can feel the old shame rising in Luke, the instinct to retreat into himself. But she does not let him. She pulls him back with a look that is not gentle or encouraging in the traditional sense. It is more like a challenge, a demand that he stay present even when it is uncomfortable. And that moment redefines what the contract means to both of them. It is no longer just a power arrangement. It is a promise to be honest with each other even when honesty costs something. And I think that is the beating heart of this show, honestly. It is not the soul marks or the forbidden power or the academy politics, although all of that is rendered with impressive craft. It is the idea that real strength is forged in the willingness to be seen by someone else at your worst. Every relationship Luke builds throughout the series follows this principle, and the show deepens it each time. Because here is the thing about the forbidden soul mark that the show reveals gradually and with real narrative patience. The mark does not just bind creatures to Luke. It changes him. Every bond he forms alters his soul energy signature, which means the very thing that made him an outcast, his inability to be categorized by the system, becomes increasingly pronounced. He becomes more anomalous, more unpredictable, more powerful in ways that the Academy's framework cannot measure. And that terrifies people. Not just his rivals, but his teachers, the institution itself. The way Asgard Academy reacts to Luke's transformation is one of the most nuanced institutional critiques I have seen in a fantasy drama. The school does not become a cartoonish villain. There is no mustache-twirling headmaster declaring that Luke must be destroyed. Instead, what you get is something far more realistic and far more chilling. The institution trying to categorize, control, and ultimately co-opt something it does not understand. There are meetings in paneled rooms where faculty members debate Luke's status with a kind of clinical detachment that should make your skin crawl if you have ever been the subject of institutional scrutiny. One professor advocates for monitoring, another for expulsion, another for accelerated testing, and none of them are talking about Luke as a person. He is a variable. He is a data point. He is a potential security concern. And the show lets you sit in that dehumanization without softening it or offering easy catharsis. The pacing of the first arc is something I want to discuss because I think it will divide audiences. And I want to be upfront about that. This is not a show that rushes. If you are coming in expecting a new power-up every episode and a rival defeated every week, you might find yourself tapping your foot in the early stretch. The show takes its time establishing the emotional landscape before it starts detonating it. There are episodes where very little happens in terms of external plot progression, but a tremendous amount happens in terms of internal character development. And I think that is the right choice for a story that is ultimately about transformation. You need to feel the weight of who Luke was before you can appreciate the magnitude of who he becomes. But I also understand that this pacing will test some viewers, especially in the binge-watching era where the instinct is to skip ahead to the next dopamine hit. My advice is to let the show breathe. Let the silences do their work. Trust that the patience is building towards something, and I promise you it is. Now, as Luke begins to form additional bonds, the show introduces what I think is its most ambitious structural element, the parallel emotional arcs. Each woman Luke binds carries her own narrative thread, her own emotional wound, her own thematic purpose within the larger story. And the show is braiding these threads together with a level of care that feels almost novelistic. This is not just Luke collecting allies for his power fantasy. Each relationship forces him to confront a different dimension of himself, and each woman is, in turn, transformed by the connection in ways that serve her own arc rather than just his. There is one bond, in particular, that I think represents the show at its most emotionally daring, and it involves a creature who enters the contract not out of respect or mutual benefit, but out of desperation. She is cornered, she has no good options, and Luke's offer is the least terrible path available to her. The show does not shy away from the ethical complexity of that dynamic. Luke himself is uncomfortable with it. He knows that this bond, at least in its inception, is born from coercion, even if that was not his intent. And the show forces him to reckon with that in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable to watch in the best possible way. This particular relationship becomes a crucible for Luke's character because it asks him a question that most power fantasy protagonists never have to face. What do you owe someone who is bound to you against the fullness of their choice? And his answer to that question, which evolves over several episodes as the bond deepens and the power dynamics shift, is one of the most mature pieces of character writing I have seen in this genre. He does not simply become better. He struggles with it. He makes mistakes. He overcorrects and then undercorrects and then tries again. And the show presents this iterative process of moral growth as exactly what it is. Messy, non-linear, and fundamentally human even when the characters involved are not entirely human themselves. The visual language of the show deserves its own dedicated discussion because it is doing heavy thematic lifting in ways that are easy to appreciate on a surface level but reward closer attention. The color palette shifts as the story progresses, and it is not subtle about it, but it is effective. In Luke's early, unbound state, the world around him is rendered in muted tones, cool grays and faded blues that suggest a world that has been desaturated by despair. As each bond forms and his power grows, color bleeds back into the frame. Not all at once, but gradually, like watching a watercolor painting develop in real time. By the midpoint of the first arc, the frames are saturated and rich, and the shift is so gradual that you might not consciously notice it until you go back and rewatch the early episodes, and the contrast hits you like a wall. That is intentional. That is a production team that understands visual storytelling at a cellular level, and it is the kind of craft that elevates the entire experience. The action choreography, when it arrives, is grounded in a philosophy that I really appreciate. The fights in this show are not about spectacle for its own sake. Every combat sequence is an extension of a character dynamic. When Luke fights alongside his bound partners, the choreography reflects the state of their relationship. In moments of trust and synchronicity, the movements flow like water, complementary and seamless. In moments of tension or unresolved conflict, the choreography becomes disjointed, with characters interfering with each other's movements, creating openings for their opponents. The fights read like physical conversations, and that is rare and valuable in a genre that often treats action as a separate category from character development rather than an expression of it. I need to talk about the soundtrack, because it is doing so much heavy lifting in certain scenes that it practically becomes a character in its own right. The composer has made choices that feel both ancient and modern, blending traditional instrumentation with electronic textures in a way that creates this uncanny sonic landscape that feels appropriate for a world where myth and academy life collide. There is a particular recurring motif, a string arrangement that surfaces whenever the Forbidden Soul mark activates, and it is one of those musical ideas that burrows into your subconscious. You start to feel it before you hear it, and your body responds to it, a slight tightening in your chest, a sense of anticipation that is equal parts dread and excitement. That is the mark of a truly effective score. It trains your nervous system to react to its themes before your conscious mind catches up. The academy politics layer of the show is more intricate than I initially expected, and I want to spend some time here because it is going to matter enormously as the story moves into its later phases. Asgard Academy is not a monolith. There are factions, rivalries between departments, philosophical disagreements about the nature of soul energy and how it should be cultivated, and all of this background tension forms the ecosystem that Luke's presence disrupts. His Forbidden Soul mark is not just personally powerful, it is ideologically threatening to certain factions within the academy who have built their entire methodology around the idea that soul energy can and should be categorized, measured, and controlled. Luke represents a category error in their worldview, and the political maneuvering that begins to swirl around him as his power becomes more visible is handled with a sophistication that keeps the intrigue engaging even when it takes center stage away from the more emotionally intimate storylines. There is a scene around the middle of the early arc that I think functions as the show's thesis statement, and I want to describe it in detail because it encapsulates everything that makes this drama work. Luke has just formed his second or third bond, and he is sitting alone at night in one of the Academy's lower courtyards, a space that the production design has carefully established as his refuge. The lighting is soft, almost umber, and the soundscape has pulled back to near silence, just the ambient hum of the Academy at rest. And Luke is looking at his hands, at the marks that now trace across his skin. And there is this moment where his expression shifts from wonder to something heavier, something that looks almost like grief. Because he is beginning to understand that every bond he forms, every connection he forges, also represents a vulnerability. These women are tied to him, and he is tied to them. And if something happens to any one of them, the loss will not be abstract. It will be written on his body, literally, and he will carry it forever. The camera holds on this moment for what feels like an eternity. And there is no dialogue, no voiceover, no musical swell to tell you what to feel. Just a young man sitting with the weight of a power that is also a responsibility, that is also a chain. It is devastating. It is beautiful. It is the moment where the show transcends its genre trappings and becomes something genuinely artful. What strikes me about the show's approach to its mythology is how it handles the concept of goddesses in its world. The title itself, Monster, Terikat Dengan Devi, contains a question mark, and that punctuation choice is doing real work. The word monster is not a declaration. It is a question. And as the story unfolds, that question gets aimed in multiple directions. Is Luke a monster for wielding forbidden power? Is the system that marginalized him monstrous in its own way? Are the goddesses who begin to take notice of Luke divine in any meaningful sense? Or are they just another tier of power operating under a more flattering name? The show is deeply interested in the politics of naming and labeling, in who gets to decide what is monstrous and what is divine, and it weaves that inquiry into the fabric of its narrative with a consistency that elevates the entire project. Let me talk about the romantic dynamics for a moment, because I know that is a major draw for this audience, and the show handles romance with a thoughtfulness that I genuinely did not expect. The harem framework, and I am using that term descriptively rather than dismissively, could easily tip into territory where the women exist only in relation to Luke, orbiting him like satellites. And to be fair, there are moments where the show flirts with that gravitational pull. But it consistently corrects course by giving each woman scenes that exist entirely outside of her connection to Luke. You see her in conversation with other characters, pursuing her own objectives, wrestling with her own demons in moments when Luke is nowhere near the frame. These scenes are not filler. They are essential to making the romantic bonds feel substantial rather than performative. When a woman who has been fully developed as her own character expresses affection for Luke, it carries weight because you know she has a life outside of him. She is choosing him from a place of wholeness rather than narrative obligation. The chemistry between Luke and his various partners varies, as it should, and the show is smart about differentiating the emotional texture of each bond. One relationship is built on intellectual respect and a shared curiosity about the mysteries of the forbidden soul mark. Another is forged in combat and carries the adrenaline-soaked intensity of people who have bled together. Another is quieter, built on small kindnesses and the slow erosion of mutual wariness. And then there is the one that I think will become the audience's favorite, the one that is adversarial and teasing and full of a kind of electric friction that makes every scene between them feel like it could go in any direction. The show understands that love is not one thing. It is many things, shaped by context and chemistry and timing, and by giving each relationship its own emotional signature, it avoids the trap of repetition that kills so many multi-partner narratives. Now I want to address the antagonist landscape, because the show is building something more complex than a simple good versus evil framework. The threats that Luke faces are layered and evolving, and they come from multiple directions simultaneously. There are rival students who view him as a threat to their status. There are institutional forces that want to study, control, or eliminate the forbidden mark. There are external entities, forces from beyond the academy's walls, who are drawn to the mark's energy like predators scenting blood. And then there is the ambiguity of the mark itself, the possibility that this power has its own agenda, its own hunger, its own price that has not yet been fully disclosed. The show keeps all of these threat vectors active at different intensities, so you never quite relax into a single conflict. There is always something lurking at the edge of the frame, always a reason to feel uneasy even in the happiest moments, and that ambient tension is crucial to the show's emotional architecture. The way the show uses the concept of a contract is worth unpacking because it is operating on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, the contracts are magical mechanisms with defined terms and consequences. But the show consistently uses them as metaphors for real-world relationship dynamics, for the invisible agreements we make with the people we love, for the ways we bind ourselves to others through choice and circumstance, and sometimes through desperation. When a contract in the show is renegotiated, it mirrors the real-world process of a relationship evolving, of needs changing, of power dynamics shifting. When a contract is threatened, it echoes the fear of losing someone you have come to depend on. The magical system is the show's way of externalizing the emotional mechanics of human connection, and it works because it is grounded in recognizable feelings even when the surface is fantastical. The supporting cast around Luke is populated with characters who could easily have been cardboard cutouts, but are instead given enough dimensionality to feel like they exist beyond the borders of the screen. Luke's classmates are not just an undifferentiated mass of bullies and rivals. Some of them are sympathetic, caught in their own pressures and insecurities. Some of them are genuinely trying to be good people within a system that rewards cruelty. One character in particular, a fellow low-rank student who befriends Luke in the early episodes, provides a grounding presence that humanizes the academy environment. This character is not powerful. They're not destined for greatness. They're just someone trying to get through the day. And their friendship with Luke provides a warmth that balances the show's darker currents. The fact that the show invests in this kind of relationship, one that has no romantic or combative payoff, just genuine companionship, tells you a lot about its values. I want to circle back to the visual effects work, because as the show progresses and Luke's power grows, the demands on the VFX team escalate dramatically, and the results are impressive for what appears to be a television budget. The Forbidden Soul Mark's manifestations become increasingly elaborate as new bonds are added, and the team has created a visual language for the Mark's energy that is distinct from the show's standard magic system. Standard soul energy in the Academy is rendered in clean, geometric patterns, orderly and contained, reflecting the institution's philosophy of control and categorization. The Forbidden Mark's energy is organic, flowing, almost biological, like watching neural pathways light up or mycorrhizal networks spreading beneath a forest floor. The visual contrast between these two energy systems reinforces the show's thematic argument about the difference between rigid institutional power and the wilder, more connected strength that Luke is developing. Every time the two systems clash on screen, the visual friction is genuinely thrilling. The direction of key scenes shows a creative team that is thinking about space and blocking in ways that serve the story's emotional logic. In confrontational scenes, the camera tends to position itself at uncomfortable proximity, almost too close to the characters' faces, creating a claustrophobic intimacy that makes you feel the pressure. In scenes of emotional openness, the camera pulls back, giving the characters room to breathe, and the wider frames feel like relief after the tight close-ups. This is not accidental. This is a director who understands that physical space on screen is an emotional resource, and who deploys it with precision. There's a blocking choice in a mid-hour confrontation scene where Luke faces off against an institutional authority figure, and the camera slowly, almost imperceptibly, drifts to a lower angle as the scene progresses, subtly tilting the power dynamic in Luke's favor without any dialogue or action to signal the shift. That is the kind of craft that rewards repeat viewing, and it is happening throughout this show. The editing rhythm is another element that I think deserves attention, because it makes unconventional choices that serve the story's emotional pacing. In moments of high tension, the editing does not always go to rapid cuts. Sometimes it holds. Sometimes it lets a moment stretch past the point of comfort, forcing you to sit in the discomfort rather than being swept through it by kinetic cutting. And then in quieter moments, the editing occasionally surprises you with a sharp cut that disrupts the calm, a reminder that in this world, peace is always temporary. The editorial philosophy seems to be that rhythm should reflect emotional truth rather than generic pacing conventions, and it gives the show a texture that feels distinctive even within a crowded genre. The way the show handles exposition deserves specific praise because it employs a technique that I wish more fantasy dramas would adopt. Instead of long monologues explaining the history of the academy or the mechanics of soul energy, the show embeds its lore into the texture of everyday scenes. You learn about the world through background details, through offhand comments from characters who live in this reality and therefore do not pause to explain it, through environmental storytelling that rewards attentive viewing. If you are a newcomer and you feel a little lost in the early episodes, that is by design. The show trusts you to piece things together, to accept that you will not understand everything immediately, and to find satisfaction in the gradual unfolding of understanding. It is a confidence in the audience that I find deeply refreshing, and it makes the world feel lived in rather than stage-managed for your benefit. I think the most surprising thing about Monster, Terikat Dengan Devi, and I say this as someone who has seen a lot of this genre, is how effectively it uses its premise to explore loneliness. Not romantic loneliness, not the typical anime protagonist who just needs a girl to believe in him, but the deeper, structural loneliness of someone who exists in a system that has no place for them. Luke's isolation at Asgard Academy is not just about being weak. It is about being uncategorizable, about having a soul that does not match any template the world provides, and the loneliness of that experience is rendered with such specificity that it transcends the fantasy setting. Anyone who has ever felt like they did not fit into the box that was assigned to them, anyone who has ever been measured by a system that was not built for people like them, will find something achingly familiar in Luke's early experience. And the show argues, through the mechanism of the forbidden soul mark and the bonds it creates, that the antidote to that loneliness is not conformity. It is finding the people whose souls resonate with yours on a frequency that the system cannot measure. The mythology of the goddesses, which becomes increasingly important as the story unfolds, adds another dimension to the show's exploration of power. The goddesses are not distant, abstract figures. They are present, attentive, and politically motivated, and their interest in Luke is not benevolent. It is strategic. They see in his forbidden mark a potential asset, a weapon, a tool, and the show uses their attention to complicate the power fantasy that the harem setup might otherwise suggest. Luke is not just gaining admirers. He is attracting predators dressed in divinity, and the show is clear-eyed about the difference between being desired and being valued. When a goddess turns her attention to Luke, it feels less like a romance and more like a geopolitical event, and the stakes shift accordingly. I keep thinking about a specific moment from the early middle stretch of the show where Luke is in a training exercise and his bound partner is injured. Not seriously, not fatally, but enough to feel it. And the way Luke reacts tells you everything about where his character is at that point. He does not fly into a rage. He does not unlock some hidden power through the sheer force of his emotion. Instead, he goes very still, quiet. And in that stillness, you can see him making a calculation that is entirely new for him. Not about how to get stronger, but about what he is willing to risk to protect the people who have chosen to stand with him. It is a subtle shift, and it is not played for drama, but it marks a turning point in his psychology that reverberates through everything that follows. Luke Wayne is not becoming a hero in the conventional sense. He is becoming someone who has decided that his bonds are worth defending even if the cost is his own safety. And that decision is quieter and more powerful than any power-up could ever be. The show's treatment of the Academy's power structure deepens as Luke's presence begins to destabilize the established order. What I find particularly intelligent about this development is that the destabilization is not a revolution. Luke is not trying to tear down the system. He is not a rebel with a manifesto. He is simply existing in a way that the system was not designed to accommodate, and the friction of that mismatch is what creates the political tremors. The show is making a point about how institutions often create their own crisis by refusing to adapt to the reality of the people they serve. And it does so without turning Luke into a symbol or a martyr. He is just a person trying to navigate a world that keeps shifting under his feet. And the show is wise enough to understand that the most profound disruptions often come not from those who seek to overthrow the system, but from those who simply refuse to be erased by it. Let me talk about the sound design in combat sequences, because it is a layer of the show that often goes unnoticed but is essential to the visceral impact of the action. When Luke's forbidden soul mark activates during a fight, the sound mix subtly layers in a heartbeat, not his heartbeat, but a deeper, more resonant pulse that feels like it is coming from the mark itself. It sits underneath the combat sounds, almost subliminal, and it creates this physiological response in the viewer that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Your own heart starts to sync with it. It is a technique borrowed from horror filmmaking, and its application here, in a fantasy combat context, is innovative and effective. The sound team understands that the forbidden mark should feel alive, and they achieve that through audio almost more than through visuals. As the first arc builds toward its climax, the show begins to accelerate without losing its emotional depth, and that is a difficult balance to maintain. The threats converge. The institutional pressure on Luke intensifies. His relationships deepen and become more complex. And through it all, the show maintains its commitment to character-driven storytelling, refusing to sacrifice emotional nuance on the altar of plot momentum. There is a confrontation scene, one of the most significant in the early part of the story, where Luke faces an opponent who is not evil but is genuinely convinced that the forbidden mark is a threat that must be neutralized. The scene is structured as a philosophical debate as much as a physical confrontation, and it forces both Luke and the audience to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that the other side has a point. The forbidden mark is dangerous. It is unpredictable. It could, theoretically, cause immense harm. Luke's defense is not that the mark is safe, but that he, as a person, deserves the chance to prove that he can wield it responsibly, and the show presents that argument with all its strength and all its fragility. It is not a triumphant moment. It is a desperate one, and it is all the more powerful for that desperation. The visual effects in this climactic sequence are the show's most ambitious, and they deliver. The forbidden mark's energy manifests in a way we have not seen before, more expansive, more intense, and the rendering is genuinely impressive. There is a moment where the mark's energy collides with the Academy's conventional soul energy, and the visual representation of that collision, organic flow meeting geometric order, is both beautiful and narratively loaded. You are watching the show's central thematic conflict rendered in light and shadow, and spectacle serves the story rather than replacing it. That is the mark of a production team that understands the difference between visual excess and visual storytelling, and I think it is one of the most effective sequences in recent fantasy drama. I want to take a moment to address something that I think might be a point of contention for some viewers, and I want to be honest about it. The harem elements of the show, while handled with more depth and nuance than the genre typically offers, are still present and prominent. If the concept of multiple romantic interests forming bonds with a single protagonist is fundamentally unappealing to you, this show is unlikely to convert you. It does its best work within the framework, but the framework is what it is. What I will say is that within the boundaries of its genre, this show demonstrates a level of respect for its female characters and a complexity in its romantic dynamics that puts many of its peers to shame. But if you cannot meet the premise on its own terms, that is a legitimate preference, and the show, for all its strengths, will not override it. Now, let me go deep on something that I think is the show's most surprising and effective choice: and it is one that I did not fully appreciate until I sat with the episodes for a while after watching. The Forbidden Soul Mark, this source of power that is supposed to elevate Luke above his peers, comes with a cost that is not immediately obvious but becomes increasingly apparent as the story unfolds. Each bond Luke forms does not just give him power, it increases his exposure. His soul's signature becomes more visible, more detectable, more trackable to entities and forces that he does not yet understand. The mark is not a gift. It is a beacon, and the show reveals this reality so gradually that by the time you understand the full implications, the dread has been building in your subconscious for episodes without you consciously registering it. That is masterful long-form storytelling. The show planted seeds in your emotional garden and let them grow in darkness. And by the time they bloom, you realize you have been feeling the roots beneath your feet for a long time. This revelation recontextualizes everything that came before. Every triumphant moment, every new bond, every display of growing power now carries an asterisk. The victories are real, but so are the consequences. And the show forces both Luke and the audience to sit with the uncomfortable truth that power gained through unconventional means often comes with unconventional costs. It is not a punishment narrative. The show is not moralizing. It is simply presenting the reality that in a world governed by systems and hierarchies, existing outside those systems comes with risks that are proportional to the rewards. And the rewards are immense, but so are the risks. The relationships that Luke has built become the story's most valuable currency in this new context. Because now every bond is not just a source of strength, but a potential vulnerability, not just for Luke, but for the women bound to him. And the way the show handles this shift is not melodramatic. There are no tearful scenes of women begging Luke to release them from the contract for their own safety. Instead, there are conversations. Real, difficult, honest conversations about risk and choice and what it means to stay connected to someone whose very existence is becoming increasingly dangerous. These scenes are quiet and powerful, and they reaffirm the show's commitment to treating its characters as adults capable of making informed decisions about their own lives. I have to give special attention to the performance work in these negotiation scenes because they require a level of emotional precision that is genuinely challenging. The actors have to convey simultaneously that they love this person, that they are afraid, that they are angry about the situation if not about each other, and that they are choosing to stay even knowing the cost. That is a lot of emotional layers to play in a single scene, and the cast handles it with remarkable consistency. There's a moment where one of Luke's partners tells him, in a voice that is perfectly controlled and absolutely shattering beneath the surface, that she knew what she was signing up for, and she is not going to pretend otherwise. It is the kind of line delivery that rewires your understanding of the entire relationship in a single sentence, and it is the product of an actor who has internalized their character so completely that the performance feels less like acting and more like remembering. The show's use of flashback and memory as a storytelling device deserves recognition because it deploys these tools sparingly and effectively. We get glimpses into the pasts of various characters, not as info dumps, but as emotional windows that recontextualize present behavior. When we see a fragment of a character's history, it is always in service of understanding a current moment, and the editing integrates these flashbacks with a fluidity that never disrupts the narrative flow. One flashback sequence in particular, which reveals the origins of the Forbidden Soul Mark itself, is rendered in a completely different visual style from the rest of the show, almost painterly, with rougher textures and warmer tones, as if the memory is being filtered through centuries of retelling. It is a creative choice that tells you immediately that this is old history, mythologized and transformed through the passage of time. And it is both beautiful and slightly unreliable in a way that serves the show's interest in the instability of narrative and the politics of who controls the story. The comedy in this show, and there is comedy, is more organic and character-driven than I expected. It arises naturally from personality clashes, from the awkwardness of Luke navigating relationships with women who are each formidable in their own right, and who do not always get along with each other. There is a scene where two of Luke's bound partners are forced to cooperate on a training exercise, and their competitive dynamic produces moments of genuine hilarity that are rooted entirely in character rather than in situational gags. The show earns its laughs by trusting its characters to be funny in the way that real people are funny, which is usually by accident and at each other's expense. It provides necessary breathing room between the heavier moments and demonstrates the show's tonal versatility. The ensemble dynamics expand as the story progresses, and the show handles the increasing complexity with impressive organizational skill. Adding characters to an ensemble without losing the development of existing ones is one of the hardest things in serialized storytelling, and this show manages it by being strategic about focus. Not every character gets equal screen time in every stretch of the story. The show rotates its spotlight, giving different relationships and character arcs room to develop in concentrated bursts rather than trying to service everyone in every episode. This means that sometimes a character will step into the background for a few episodes, and when they return to focus, the impact of their presence is renewed rather than diluted. It is a smart structural choice that keeps the ensemble feeling fresh even as it grows. The philosophical underpinnings of the show's magic system are more developed than I initially gave them credit for. The concept of a soul mark, forbidden or otherwise, is based on the idea that the soul is not a static entity but a dynamic, evolving system that can be shaped by connection. This has implications for the show's treatment of identity and selfhood that are genuinely interesting. If your soul is altered by every bond you form, are you still the same person you were before? If your power is fundamentally relational, can it ever truly belong to you alone? The show raises these questions implicitly through its narrative rather than explicitly through dialogue, and it trusts the audience to engage with the philosophical implications without having them spelled out. That is a level of intellectual respect that I find deeply appealing and that rewards viewers who bring their own reflections to the experience. I want to spend some time on one of the secondary antagonists, who I think is one of the show's most interesting characters, and who provides a crucial counterpoint to Luke's arc. This is a high-ranking student at Asgard Academy who embodies everything the system values: discipline, categorizable power, adherence to protocol, and a belief in the natural order of rankings and hierarchies. This character is not a villain in any traditional sense. They're a product of the system, shaped by its values and rewarded by its structure, and their conflict with Luke is ideological as much as personal. They genuinely believe that the forbidden mark is dangerous, that Luke's unconventional power threatens the stability of the Academy, and that the system's way of measuring and ranking souls is fundamentally correct. And the show does something really brave with this character. It lets them be right about some things. The forbidden mark is dangerous. Luke's power is unpredictable. The system's concerns are not entirely unfounded. By giving the opposition genuine merit, the show elevates the central conflict from a simple underdog story to a complex negotiation between order and freedom, tradition and innovation, safety and growth. The rivalry between this character and Luke is electric precisely because it is not personal. They do not hate each other. They disagree, fundamentally, about the nature of power and the purpose of the institution they both inhabit. Their confrontations are intellectual chess matches as much as physical contests, and the show stages them with a deliberateness that highlights the strategic dimension. There is a scene where they debate in front of the faculty, and the camera alternates between tight close-ups of their faces and wider shots that include the watching professors, reminding you that this conflict is not happening in a vacuum. It has an audience. It has institutional stakes. And the outcome will shape the Academy's future regardless of who wins. The romantic subplot involving this rival is one of the show's most daring narrative choices. And I want to discuss it without giving too much away because the way it unfolds is one of the show's genuine surprises. There is a moment, not a sudden turn, but a gradual dawning, where the ideological conflict between Luke and this character begins to blur with something more personal, more intimate, And the show handles this blurring with such subtlety that you almost miss it the first time through. It is the kind of development that on paper sounds like a cliché, enemies to lovers, but in execution is anything but, because the show does not sacrifice the ideological conflict on the altar of romantic attraction. The disagreement remains. The fundamental difference in worldview persists. And the question becomes whether love can exist alongside genuine difference, whether affection can coexist with opposition. And the show's answer is complicated and honest, and ultimately more satisfying than any simple resolution could be. The pacing shifts as the story moves from the early arc into the middle stretch. And this is where I think the show finds its true rhythm. The early episodes were building the foundation, establishing the world, the characters, and the emotional stakes. The middle stretch is where the story starts to pay off those investments, and the acceleration feels earned rather than rushed because of the groundwork that was laid. Plot threads that seemed incidental in the early episodes resurface with new significance. Character traits that were established as quirks reveal themselves as narrative tools. The show's long-term plotting is evident in the way these callbacks land, and it creates a cumulative effect where each episode feels richer than the last because it is adding to a growing body of interconnected narrative. The introduction of external threats beyond the academy walls marks a significant escalation in both scale and stakes. The show has been hinting at forces beyond the institution's borders since the early episodes, through rumors, through fragments of conversation, through the nervous energy of faculty members who know more than they are saying. When these threats finally materialize, the shift in the show's scope is dramatic. The academy, which has felt like the entire world, suddenly reveals itself to be an island in a much larger ocean, and the realization that Luke's forbidden mark has significance far beyond campus politics raises the stakes in a way that is both exciting and terrifying. The show handles this expansion without losing its intimate focus, which is a testament to the writing team's discipline. Even as the world grows larger, the emotional core remains centered on the relationships and the internal journeys of the characters, and the external threats are filtered through that emotional lens rather than replacing it. The mythological layer of the story becomes increasingly prominent as the goddesses enter the narrative more directly. These are not benevolent figures. They are power players with their own agendas, their own histories, their own political calculations, and their interest in Luke is complicated and layered. One goddess sees the forbidden mark as a tool she can exploit. Another sees it as a threat to her domain. Another sees in Luke a potential equal, and her attention carries a weight that is equal parts flattering and suffocating. The show uses the goddesses to explore the idea that divinity is not the opposite of humanity, but an amplification of it with all the beauty and ugliness that implies. These are not archetypes. They are characters with motivations and flaws and the kind of political savvy that makes them formidable not just in power, but in cunning. The way Luke navigates the attention of these divine figures reveals another dimension of his character that has been developing quietly throughout the story. He is learning to read people, to understand power dynamics, not just in combat, but in conversation, in negotiation, in the subtle exchanges of influence that determine outcomes before any blade is drawn. The boy who entered Asgard Academy unable to meet anyone's gaze is now engaging with goddesses as a participant rather than a pawn. And the transformation is not sudden or dramatic. It is the slow, steady result of every conversation, every bond, every moment of vulnerability that preceded it. Luke's growth is not a montage. It is a process, and the show respects the difference enough to show its full, uncomfortable, beautiful complexity. There is a visual motif that runs through the show that I want to highlight because it is subtle and effective: the use of reflections. Mirrors, water surfaces, polished metal. The show consistently frames Luke in reflected surfaces at moments of identity crisis. When he is questioning who he is becoming, the camera finds a reflection. When he is at peace with himself, he is shot straight on, directly, without the mediation of a surface. This is not heavy-handed. It is a gentle visual rhythm that reinforces the show's preoccupation with identity and self-perception, and it adds a layer of artistry to the visual storytelling that enriches the experience for attentive viewers. The supporting cast expands into some genuinely memorable figures as the story progresses. There is a mentor character, an older figure at the academy, who recognizes the significance of Luke's mark and takes an interest in his development, and this character is written with a moral ambiguity that keeps you guessing. Are they helping Luke because they believe in him or because they see an opportunity? Are they protecting him or positioning themselves? The show never fully resolves this ambiguity, and that irresolution is a strength. Not every mentor needs to be an Obi-Wan. Sometimes the most interesting guides are the ones whose motivations you cannot entirely trust, and this character fills that role with a complexity that enriches every scene they appear in. The music during emotional scenes deserves another mention because the composer has created leitmotifs for the various relationships that evolve as the relationships themselves evolve. The musical theme for Luke's first bond sounds different in the early episodes than it does in the middle of the story. The instrumentation is richer, the harmonies more complex, reflecting the deepening of the connection. This kind of musical character development requires close collaboration between the composer and the writing team, and the result is a score that enhances the emotional narrative rather than simply accompanying it. There is a scene late in the first arc where all of these themes briefly interweave, a moment where Luke is surrounded by his partners, and the score layers each relationship's motif into a single, complex arrangement, and the effect is overwhelming in the best possible way. It is the musical equivalent of the show's emotional thesis, that strength comes from connection, and connection is beautiful precisely because it is complex. The show's exploration of what it means to be a monster is its most philosophically rich thread, and it weaves through every level of the narrative. Luke is called a monster by those who fear the forbidden mark. The creatures he binds have been labeled monsters by a society that does not understand them. The goddesses, for all their divinity, exhibit behaviors that could easily be described as monstrous. And the system itself, the academy with its rigid hierarchies and its merciless rankings, operates with a monstrous indifference to the individuals it claims to serve. The show suggests that monster is not a category, but a perspective that what is monstrous depends entirely on who is holding the measuring stick, and that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who have convinced themselves they are righteous. Let me talk about one of the most emotionally intense sequences in the first part of the story, a sequence that I think represents the show at its dramatic peak. It involves a crisis, a moment where one of Luke's bonds is threatened by an external force, and the show pulls out every tool in its emotional arsenal to make you feel the weight of that threat. The editing tightens. The sound design becomes oppressive. The color palette drains. And Luke is forced to make a choice that has no clean option, a choice between two things he values. And the show does not let him off the hook with a clever workaround. He has to sacrifice something. He has to lose something to protect something else. And the loss is real and felt and not immediately healed. This is the moment where the show earns its emotional credibility in full, because it demonstrates that it is willing to impose genuine consequences on its characters, that the bonds it has spent us building are not inviolable, and that love in this world, as in the real one, sometimes costs more than you expected to pay. The aftermath of this crisis is handled with the same care as the crisis itself, and that is crucial. The show does not race to the next plot point. It sits in the wreckage. It lets the characters react with a full range of human response: anger, denial, guilt, withdrawal, desperate tenderness. There is a scene in the immediate aftermath where Luke and his affected partner simply sit in silence, and the scene runs for what feels like an eternity, no dialogue, no music, just two people breathing in the same space and trying to figure out how to move forward after something has broken between them. It is devastating and beautiful, and it is the kind of storytelling that makes you feel grateful to be watching. The technical execution of this sequence across all departments is impressive. The cinematography shifts to handheld during the crisis, introducing a rawness and instability that mirrors the emotional chaos. The color grading bleeds toward cooler tones, draining warmth from the frame. The sound mix emphasizes individual sounds, a heartbeat, a breath, the scrape of stone, isolating them from the ambient noise to create an almost hallucinatory clarity. And the acting, across the board, is operating at a level that requires no dialogue to communicate. Faces tell the entire story. Bodies tell the entire story. The space between characters tells the entire story. This is filmmaking that understands the power of showing rather than telling, and it is deployed here with devastating effectiveness. I want to address the show's handling of consent and agency within its contractual framework because it is a topic that is both relevant and potentially contentious, and the show engages with it more seriously than I expected. The contracts are magical bindings, and the show is honest about the fact that a binding, by definition, limits freedom. Luke is aware of this. He wrestles with it, and the show creates space for the women bound to him to express ambivalence about the arrangement even as they choose to remain within it. This is not a cop-out. The show does not pretend that consent is simple when magic is involved. Instead, it presents consent as an ongoing negotiation, something that must be continuously reaffirmed and reevaluated, not a one-time event, but a living process. It is a mature handling of a thorny subject, and it demonstrates the show's commitment to engaging honestly with the implications of its own premise. The world beyond the academy begins to take shape through fragments and implications, and the show is smart about how it expands the scope without losing focus. We hear about nations, about conflicts between divine factions, about the history of forbidden marks and the wars they have inspired. But this information arrives through character dialogue and reaction rather than through exposition dumps, and it is always tied to the emotional stakes of the present moment. When a character mentions a historical event involving a forbidden mark, it is because that history is directly relevant to a decision Luke is facing right now, and the relevance gives the lore immediate urgency rather than academic interest. This is world building in service of storytelling, and it is the only kind that matters. The show's treatment of strength and weakness is one of its most consistent and compelling themes. Luke begins the story defined by his weakness, measured and confirmed by the Academy's ranking system. His forbidden mark gives him power, but the show is careful to distinguish between power and strength. Power is the mark's gift. Strength is something Luke builds through his relationships, through his choices, through his willingness to be vulnerable and honest and present. The show argues, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that the Academy's definition of strength, raw soul energy output, combat effectiveness, categorizable metrics, is not just incomplete but actively misleading. True strength, the show suggests, is relational. It is built through connection. It is measured not in individual output, but in the quality of the bonds you form and your willingness to sustain them through difficulty. This is a radical reframing of the power fantasy genre, and it gives the show a philosophical backbone that supports its narrative with genuine intellectual weight. The Academy examinations, which are a recurring structural element in the early and middle portions of the story, serve as both plot mechanisms and thematic commentary. Each examination is a public performance, a moment where students are measured and ranked and judged by the institution, and the show uses these scenes to dramatize the anxiety and dehumanization of being evaluated by a system that reduces you to a number. Luke's experiences in these examinations are particularly charged because his forbidden mark produces results that the system literally cannot score. He breaks the metrics. He defies categorization. And the reactions of the faculty and student body to his anomalous performances range from fascination to horror to denial, and each reaction tells you something about the character's relationship to the institutional framework. The examinations are some of the show's most tense and thematically rich scenes, and they provide recurring structural beats that anchor the most sprawling narrative elements. I find myself particularly drawn to the way the show handles moments of quiet triumph. Not the big, dramatic victories, which are effective but expected in this genre. The small ones. The moments where Luke succeeds not through power, but through empathy, where he resolves a conflict not through force, but through understanding, where he earns respect not by being the strongest, but by being the most honest. These moments are given the same visual and narrative weight as the combat sequences, and that equality of treatment sends a powerful message about what the show values. It is saying clearly and consistently that the ability to connect is as heroic as the ability to fight, and that the most meaningful victories are often the ones that happen in conversation rather than in combat. The show's handling of the passage of time is worth noting because it does not always follow conventional episodic structure. Some episodes cover a single day in intense detail. Others compress weeks into a montage. The rhythm is dictated by the emotional needs of the story rather than by a rigid format. And this flexibility allows the show to spend as much time as it needs on crucial moments while moving efficiently through transitional periods. It creates a viewing experience that feels organic rather than mechanical, as if the story is unfolding according to its own internal clock rather than an external schedule. This can be disorienting at first, especially for viewers accustomed to more structured episodic storytelling, but once you adjust the show's rhythm, it becomes one of its most appealing qualities. The performance of the actress playing one of the goddesses, the one whose interest in Luke is most ambiguous, deserves special mention because she is doing something incredibly difficult. Playing a character who is simultaneously alluring and threatening, who operates on a scale of power that makes her fundamentally other, but who must still be emotionally legible to the audience. She achieves this through stillness more than through expression, through the way she holds her body, through the strategic deployment of warmth that you can never quite be sure is genuine. She is the human embodiment of the show's question about divinity. Is the goddess interested in Luke because she cares about him, or because she wants to use him? And is there a meaningful difference when the power differential is this extreme? The actress refuses to give you a definitive answer, and that refusal is what makes the performance so compelling. I am going to take a sharp turn here and talk about something that I think does not get enough attention in discussions of this kind of show, the physicality of the world. Asgard Academy is not just a set. It is a space that characters inhabit with their bodies, and the show is attentive to the way physical environment shapes behavior. The high-ceiling halls of the Upper Academy encourage a certain kind of movement, confident, expansive, performative. The tighter spaces of the lower levels encourage compression, withdrawal, a kind of physical apology. Luke's body language shifts as his power grows, and it is not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual unfolding. He stands a little straighter. He takes up a little more space. He meets eyes that he used to avoid. The actor has calibrated this physical arc with extraordinary precision, and it mirrors the emotional arc in a way that feels completely natural rather than choreographed. The action sequences increase in scale and complexity as the story progresses, and the choreography team deserves credit for keeping them grounded in character even as the spectacle escalates. Each fight tells a story. Each combat dynamic reflects a relationship, and the show consistently uses action as a vehicle for emotional development rather than as a break from it. There is a mid-arc fight scene where Luke and one of his partners are forced to synchronize their abilities under extreme pressure, and the choreography is designed so that their movements tell you everything about the state of their relationship. Moments of harmony, moments of discord, moments where one reaches for the other and misses, moments where they move as one. The fight is visually spectacular, but its true power lies in what it communicates about the characters. And that is exactly how action should function in a character-driven story. The show's villain architecture continues to develop with impressive complexity as the story moves deeper. The layered antagonist structure, institutional, personal, external, divine, creates a threat landscape that feels genuinely unpredictable. You never quite know where the next danger is coming from, And the show uses this uncertainty to maintain tension even in relatively quiet episodes. Every conversation has the potential to become a confrontation. Every alliance has the potential to fracture. Every victory has the potential to reveal an unforeseen cost. The show lives in that space of productive anxiety, and it uses it to keep the audience engaged not through cheap cliffhangers, but through the constant, nagging awareness that in this world, nothing is safe and nothing is free. There is a sequence, one that I think is among the most memorable in recent fantasy drama, where Luke enters a space that has been forbidden to students, a sealed chamber deep within the academy where the oldest records of soulmark research are kept. The scene is constructed as a descent, both literal and metaphorical, with the camera following Luke through progressively narrower, darker, more oppressive spaces until he reaches the chamber itself. The production design in this sequence is extraordinary. The chamber is ancient, covered in markings that seem to pulse with dormant energy, and the lighting is sourced from the marks themselves, a cold bioluminescent glow that casts strange shadows. Luke touches the records, and the information floods into him through the forbidden mark in a sensory overload that the show renders through a combination of visual effects, sound design, and editing that is genuinely disorienting. For about 30 seconds, the show abandons conventional narrative structure and gives you pure, overwhelming sensation. And it works because it places you inside Luke's experience rather than outside it. The information Luke gains from this chamber recontextualizes much of what came before, and this is where the show's long-term plotting reveals its full sophistication. Details that seemed like background noise in earlier episodes now glow with significance. Character behaviors that seemed arbitrary now make sense. The show has been constructing a puzzle in plain sight, trusting you to either catch the pieces or be rewarded by the revelation. And the satisfaction of that revelation is proportional to the patience you invested in the setup. I am going to be careful about what I say here because the specific contents of what Luke discovers are among the show's most tightly guarded narrative secrets. But I will say that it involves the origins of the forbidden soul mark, its connection to the goddesses, and the true nature of the academy itself. Each of these revelations has implications that ripple outward through every level of the story, and the show handles the information with the gravity it deserves. The emotional fallout from this discovery is the show's most challenging material, because it forces Luke to confront the possibility that his entire journey, the bonds he has formed, the power he has built, the identity he has constructed, may have been shaped by forces he did not choose and does not fully understand. It is a crisis of agency, and the show does not resolve it quickly or cleanly. Luke withdraws. He becomes uncertain in ways that echo his early characterization, but with the added weight of everything he has experienced since. The regression feels real because it is not a reset to the starting point. It is a spiral, and spirals are different from circles, because even though you may pass through the same emotional territory, you are at a different altitude each time. The way his partners respond to this withdrawal is one of the show's most affecting stretches. Each woman reacts according to her own personality and her own understanding of Luke, and the diversity of their responses creates a rich tapestry of care. One pushes, refusing to let him retreat, because that is who she is. One gives space, trusting that he will find his way back, because that is her nature. One confronts, demanding honesty even at the cost of comfort, because she values truth over harmony. And one simply stays, present and patient and unyielding in her presence, because she has learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain. These parallel responses, running simultaneously, create an emotional counterpoint that is more beautiful and more complex than any single reaction could be. And it is a testament to the show's understanding that love is not one thing but many things, each shaped by the nature of the person who gives it. I think there's something genuinely courageous about the show's willingness to slow down at this point, to resist the urge to power through the emotional crisis in favor of plot progression, and to trust that the audience will stay engaged through vulnerability rather than spectacle. In a genre that often equates momentum with entertainment, this show makes the argument that stillness can be just as compelling. That a young man sitting in a dark room trying to figure out who he is can be as riveting as any battle scene if the performance, the writing, and the direction are strong enough. And they are. They consistently are. This show's creative team understands that the most important battles are the ones fought inside. And they give those battles the same resources and attention that they give the external conflicts. As Luke emerges from this crisis, and he does emerge, the show does not pretend it did not happen. The experience leaves marks, emotional marks that inform his behavior in subtle but detectable ways. He's more cautious now, more questioning, less willing to accept power without understanding its cost. And this maturation is reflected in every aspect of his character, his dialogue, his body language, his decision-making process, his approach to his relationships. The crisis did not break him, but it changed him, and the change is permanent in the way that real emotional growth is permanent. You cannot unlearn what you have learned about yourself, even if the learning was painful, and the show honors that reality. The show's treatment of friendship deserves a dedicated moment because I think it is one of its most underrated qualities. In the midst of all the romantic bonds, the divine politics, the academy intrigue, and the forbidden power, there are friendships in this show that are as carefully developed and as emotionally significant as any romance. Luke's relationship with his non-romantic ally, the fellow student I mentioned earlier, is a constant thread of warmth and honesty that provides emotional grounding throughout the story. Their conversations have a different texture than Luke's dialogues with his partners, more relaxed, more self-deprecating, more willing to be silly. And that difference in tone tells you something important about the role that friendship plays in a life that is otherwise defined by extraordinary circumstances. Not every relationship needs to be a bond. Not every connection needs to be a contract. Sometimes you just need someone who will sit with you and complain about the cafeteria food, and the show understands that. The visual storytelling reaches new heights in the middle and later portions of the first arc, with the cinematography team making increasingly bold choices that serve the story's escalating emotional intensity. There are shots in this show that I would frame and hang on a wall, compositions that are so precisely balanced between beauty and narrative function that they operate on both an aesthetic and a storytelling level simultaneously. The use of depth of field becomes more pronounced as the story progresses, with backgrounds increasingly blurred in moments of emotional focus, as if the world outside the character's immediate experience is literally losing definition. It is a subtle technique, but it reinforces the show's commitment to prioritizing interiority over spectacle, emotion over event, character over plot. The score reaches its most ambitious territory in the middle stretch, with the composer introducing vocal elements that add a haunting dimension to the already rich musical landscape. The vocals are not lyrics in the conventional sense. They're more like textures, wordless expressions that sit at the edge of comprehension, as if the music itself is trying to articulate something that language cannot capture. This is particularly effective in scenes involving the goddesses, where the vocal elements create an otherworldly atmosphere that reinforces the divine presence without resorting to obvious religious or mythological signifiers. The score is doing sophisticated atmospheric work, and it deserves recognition as one of the show's most consistently excellent technical elements. Let me talk about the thematic resonance of the contract system one more time, because I think it is doing something that I have not fully articulated yet. The contracts in this show are not just magical mechanisms or relationship metaphors. They're the show's argument about the nature of power itself. In the Academy's framework, power is hierarchical. It flows from the top down. It is accumulated individually and measured against others. The Forbidden Soul mark introduces a different paradigm: power as network, as web, as system of mutual dependence and shared strength. Luke's power does not diminish when it is shared. It grows. His partner's power does not diminish when it is connected to his. It transforms. The show is arguing for a model of strength that is fundamentally collaborative, fundamentally relational, fundamentally opposed to the hierarchical model that the academy represents. And this argument is not made through speeches or manifestos. It is made through narrative, through character, through the lived experience of people who discover that they are stronger together not because of some inspirational platitude, but because the mechanics of their power literally work that way. It is an argument embedded in the DNA of the story rather than pasted on top of it. And that is why it is so effective. The atmospheric tension in certain episodes approaches genuine psychological horror territory, and I think this is an intentional tonal choice that adds necessary darkness to the story's palette. The forbidden mark is not a comfortable power. It carries echoes of its history, fragments of memory and emotion from previous bearers, and the show renders these intrusions with a creep factor that is genuinely unsettling. There are moments where Luke is alone, and the mark seems to act independently, producing visions or sensations that blur the line between memory and premonition. And the show stages these moments with a horror filmmaker's instinct for timing and atmosphere. They are not frequent enough to dominate the tone, but they are consistent enough to maintain an undercurrent of dread that keeps the audience from ever fully relaxing into the power fantasy. It is a smart tonal calibration that prevents the show from becoming either too dark or too light, maintaining a balance that keeps the emotional stakes perpetually active. The relationship between the Academy's institutional identity and its physical architecture deepens as the story reveals more about the institution's history. We learn, through the show's characteristic method of embedded exposition, that Asgard Academy was not always as rigidly hierarchical as it is now. There was a time, centuries ago, when different approaches to soul energy were tolerated, even celebrated. The current system is the product of a specific historical event, a crisis that led to the institutionalization of control and categorization as survival mechanisms. This backstory does not excuse the system's present failings, but it does explain them, and that explanation adds complexity to the show's institutional critique. The Academy is not evil. It is traumatized. It is an institution that experienced a catastrophe and overcorrected so severely that it became the very thing it was trying to prevent. That is a more interesting and more honest critique than a simple power corrupts narrative, and it gives the show's political dimensions a depth that enriches every scene of institutional conflict. The way this historical context recontextualizes the forbidden soul mark is one of the show's most elegant narrative moves. The mark is not just forbidden because it is powerful. It is forbidden because it is associated with a historical crisis that traumatized the Academy. The institution's fear of the mark is not irrational. It is the product of a genuine historical trauma, and the show's willingness to validate that fear even as it champions Luke's right to wield the mark creates a tension that resists easy resolution. There are no clean hands in this conflict. There are only perspectives, and the show invites you to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into a simple good versus evil framework. I keep coming back to the show's emotional patience, its willingness to let moments breathe, and I think this quality is most evident in the way it handles transitions between major narrative beats. In a less confident show, the transition from a high-intensity crisis to a quieter character scene would feel like a downshift, a loss of momentum. In this show, the transitions feel like inhalations, necessary pauses that allow you to process what just happened before moving into what comes next. The editing rhythm slows, the sound design pulls back, the color palette softens, and you are given space to feel. It is a storytelling philosophy that prioritizes emotional completeness over narrative speed, and it is one of the show's most distinctive and valuable qualities. I want to discuss the show's handling of power escalation because it is a challenge that many fantasy narratives struggle with, and this show navigates with notable skill. As Luke grows stronger, the show faces the classic problem of how to maintain tension when the protagonist becomes increasingly formidable. The solution here is not to simply increase the power of the opposition, which leads to an arms race that eventually becomes absurd. Instead, the show shifts the nature of the challenges Luke faces. The early challenges are physical, tests of strength and skill that can be overcome through training and determination. The later challenges are relational, ethical, philosophical, and they cannot be solved through power alone. Luke does not just need to be strong. He needs to be wise. He nedes to be compassionate. He needs to understand the consequences of his choices, not just for himself, but for the people connected to him. The power escalation continues, but it becomes less central to the tension because the show has found more interesting sources of conflict. The interpersonal dynamics between Luke's bound partners create some of the show's most textured and entertaining scenes. These women are not a monolith. They have their own relationships with each other, independent of Luke, and those relationships range from respect to open rivalry to genuine friendship. The show gives these interfemale dynamics screen time and significance, and the result is a richer ensemble that feels more like a community than a collection. There is a scene where two of the women are forced to work together on a task that requires them to combine their abilities, and their initial reluctance gives way to a grudging admiration that is one of the show's most satisfying relationship developments. The show is saying, through these dynamics, that the bonds between women are as important and as complex as the bonds between women and men, and that a story about a man surrounded by women can and should be a story about women who also have relationships with each other. The humor in these interfemale scenes is particularly sharp, and I think it reflects the show's understanding that people in close proximity are naturally funny. The competitive banter, the subtle jockeying for position, the moments of unexpected solidarity that catch everyone off guard, including the characters themselves, these are the kinds of dynamics that produce genuine comedy because they arise from recognizable human behavior rather than from scripted punchlines. The show trusts its characters to be amusing in the way that real people are amusing, which is to say unpredictably and without trying, and the result is comedy that enhances rather than disrupts the story's emotional texture. Let me circle back to the performance of the lead one more time, because I think what he is doing over the course of this extended narrative is genuinely impressive. He has to chart a character arc that spans from complete passivity to active agency, from isolation to connection, from self-loathing to self-acceptance. And he has to do it gradually enough that each step feels earned. There are no big, dramatic transformation moments where Luke suddenly becomes a different person. There are incremental shifts, barely perceptible in isolation but cumulative in effect, and the actor tracks these shifts with a consistency that suggests deep internal work. You believe Luke's growth because you can see it happening in real time, in the way he holds himself, in the way he speaks, in the way he responds to challenge and affection and threat. It is a marathon performance in a sprint-obsessed medium, and it deserves to be recognized as one of the show's greatest achievements. The exploration of what it means to be bound is the show's most persistent thematic question, and it operates on every level simultaneously. Luke is bound by the mark, bound to his partners, bound by the Academy's rules, bound by the expectations of a society that does not know what to do with him. His partners are bound by the contract, bound by their own histories, bound by the structures that brought them to this point. The goddesses are bound by their divinity, bound by their politics, bound by the ancient agreements that govern their existence. Everyone in this story is constrained in some way, and the show's most radical suggestion is that freedom is not the absence of binding, but the choice of which bindings to accept and how to inhabit them. It is a mature and nuanced perspective that elevates the show's thematic register significantly. The production values remain impressively consistent throughout the first arc, and I want to acknowledge the practical aspects of that consistency because it is not easy to maintain quality over a long-form narrative. The sets are detailed and thematically coherent. The costumes reflect character development and social position. The lighting is carefully controlled to support the emotional tone of each scene. The visual effects, while not blockbuster level, are creatively deployed to maximize impact within budget constraints. The sound design is layered and intentional. All of these elements work in concert to create a world that feels complete and immersive. And the fact that the quality does not noticeably degrade as the series progresses suggests a production team that planned carefully and executed with discipline. I want to spend some time on the show's use of silence as a dramatic tool because I think it is one of its most distinctive qualities. There are scenes in this show that are nearly silent, with dialogue reduced to a minimum and the soundscape pared back to ambient tones and breath. These scenes are among the show's most powerful because they force you to read faces and bodies and spaces rather than relying on words to tell you what to feel. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything that is not being said, all the emotions and thoughts and fears that the characters are carrying but cannot articulate. And the show trusts you to fill that silence with your own emotional understanding. It is a generous storytelling choice, one that respects the audience's intelligence and emotional literacy, and it produces moments of profound intimacy that would be diluted by dialogue. The thematic interplay between light and dark is woven through the show's visual fabric with remarkable consistency. The Forbidden Mark's energy is associated with a particular quality of light, neither fully bright nor fully dark, but something in between, a luminescence that suggests bioluminescence or moonlight on water. This aesthetic choice ties the mark to the natural world, to organic processes, to the kind of life that thrives in the margins and the shadows. And it provides a visual counterpoint to the Academy's association with clean, institutional light, the harsh brightness of fluorescent, or the sterile glow of controlled energy. The show's visual vocabulary is building a thematic argument about the nature of power and beauty, suggesting that the most vital and transformative energies are not the ones that dominate, but the ones that exist in the liminal spaces between categories. As I approach the threshold of this first deep dive, I want to pause on one final observation about what makes Monster Aku Terikat Dengan Devi special. It is a show that takes its own premise seriously. It does not wink at the audience. It does not apologize for being a fantasy drama with harem elements and academy settings. It commits fully to its world, its characters, and its themes, and it asks you to commit alongside it. That commitment is rewarded with a story that is richer, more emotionally complex, and more thematically ambitious than its genre trappings might suggest. It is a show that believes in its own story enough to tell it with care, with craft, and with genuine feeling, and that belief is infectious. By the end of the first arc, you do not just understand Luke Wayne's journey. You feel it, you carry it, and you want to see where it goes next. The shift into the later portions of the story brings with it a recalibration of stakes that is both exciting and sobering. The Academy, which has been the show's primary setting and the source of most of its conflict, begins to feel smaller as Luke's world expands. The goddesses are no longer distant figures. They are present, demanding, and their agendas intersect with Luke's in ways that are increasingly difficult to navigate. The show expands its canvas without losing its intimate focus, and this balance is maintained through a structural choice that I think is particularly smart. As the external stakes grow, the show doubles down on its internal ones. Every escalation in the external conflict is matched by an escalation in the emotional complexity of Luke's relationships, and the result is a story that feels simultaneously epic and personal, grand and intimate. The goddess who emerges as the most significant presence in the later portion of the story is a character I have been thinking about since I finished watching, and I think she represents the show at its most thematically ambitious. She is not a love interest in any conventional sense. She is a force, an intelligence, a power that is so far beyond Luke's current level that their interactions carry an inherent tension that has nothing to do with romance and everything with the fundamental question of what happens when a mortal becomes interesting to a god. The dynamic between them is not romantic. It is not adversarial. It is something else entirely, something that the show is careful not to reduce to a simple label, and the ambiguity of that dynamic is what makes it so compelling. When this goddess speaks to Luke, You are never sure whether she is offering guidance, testing his limits, or laying a trap, and the performance oscillates between warmth and calculation with a precision that keeps you perpetually off balance. The Academy's response to the increasing divine interest in Luke introduces a new layer of institutional anxiety that the show handles with its characteristic sophistication. The faculty is not monolithic in their response. Some see the divine attention as validation, proof that their institution is producing noteworthy individuals. Others see it as a threat, a sign that forces beyond their control are encroaching on their domain. And still others see it as an opportunity, a chance to leverage Luke's significance for institutional advancement. These competing responses create internal politics that are as engaging as any external conflict, and the show uses them to deepen its critique of institutional thinking, showing how the same phenomenon can be interpreted in radically different ways depending on the interpreter's position and priorities. I keep finding myself reflecting on the show's title and the question it poses. Monster? That question mark is the heart of everything. It is the question that every character in the show is asking about someone or something, and the answer is always more complicated than it appears. Luke is called a monster by those who fear the mark. He calls the system monstrous when it fails to see him as a person. The creatures he bonds with are labeled monsters by society that prefers its categories clean, and the goddesses, for all their divinity, are capable of monstrous indifference. The show is a sustained meditation on the politics of monstrosity, on who gets to define the term and how that definition serves the interests of the definers. It is a smarter and more relevant theme than a show with this premise has any right to expect, and it is handled with a sophistication that demonstrates the creative team's ambition and intelligence. The narrative structure of the later episodes becomes more complex as multiple plot lines converge and diverge with increasing frequency. The show manages this complexity through careful attention to emotional continuity, ensuring that even when the plot jumps between storylines, the emotional through line remains clear. Each scene, regardless of which plotline it serves, contributes to the show's central emotional arc, which is Luke's journey from isolation to connection and the costs and rewards of that journey. This emotional coherence is the show's structural backbone, and it allows the narrative to sprawl without becoming incoherent, to experiment without losing its audience, to surprise without betraying its fundamental commitments. The show's treatment of sacrifice is nuanced and refuses the martyrdom narrative that often accompanies stories about power and responsibility. When Luke makes sacrifices, they're not played as heroic gestures. They're messy, painful, and sometimes questionable. The show allows you to wonder whether a particular sacrifice was necessary or whether Luke is being self-destructive. It allows other characters to challenge his choices, to call him out when his selflessness becomes self-punishment, and to hold him accountable for the impact of his decisions on the people who love him. This complexity makes Luke a more believable character, and the show a more honest exploration of what it actually costs to care about other people in a world that is constantly trying to take things from you. I want to talk about the visual representation of the contracts themselves, because the show has developed an increasingly sophisticated visual language for these bonds as the story progresses. Early on, the contracts are represented simply: a mark, a glow, a visible connection. But as the relationships deepen and the contracts evolve, the visual representation becomes more complex, incorporating elements that reflect the specific nature of each bond. The contract with the intellectual partner has a crystalline quality, precise and structured. The contract with the combat partner has a fiery quality, dynamic and unpredictable. The contract with the reluctant partner has a quality that is harder to describe, something like water under tension, a surface that could break at any moment. These visual distinctions are subtle enough to avoid distraction, but clear enough to reward attentive viewing, and they add a layer of visual storytelling that enriches the experience of each relationship. The show's thematic engagement with the concept of freedom versus security becomes increasingly central as the external threats escalate. The academy, for all its faults, represents safety. The rules, for all their limitations, represent predictability. Luke's path represents the opposite. Freedom, but freedom without guarantees, power without safety nets, growth without guardrails. The show does not pretend that this choice is easy or obvious. It presents the appeal of security honestly, acknowledging that the desire for safety is not weakness but wisdom, and that the choice to pursue freedom is a gamble that could cost everything. This thematic tension runs through every decision Luke makes, and the show is wise enough to present it as an ongoing negotiation rather than a resolved question. The sound design continues to be one of the show's most consistently excellent technical elements, and I want to highlight a particular technique that becomes more prominent in the later episodes: the use of spatial audio to create a sense of divine presence. When the goddesses are near, the sound mix introduces subtle spatial effects that create a sense of vastness, as if the space around the characters has expanded to accommodate a presence that exists on a different scale. It is an almost subliminal effect, but it contributes enormously to the atmosphere of divine encounters, making them feel genuinely otherworldly rather than simply dramatic. The sound team is doing work that deserves awards consideration, and I do not say that lightly. The ensemble continues to develop in unexpected and rewarding ways as the story reaches its middle to later territory. Characters who seemed peripheral in the early episodes reveal hidden depths. Alliances shift. Friendships deepen. And the show keeps finding new combinations of characters to put in rooms together, each combination producing different dynamics and different emotional textures. It is the narrative equivalent of a musician discovering new chord progressions from familiar notes, and it keeps the ensemble feeling vibrant and unpredictable even after dozens of episodes. There is a confrontation scene near the end of the first major arc that brings together nearly every thread the show has been weaving, and the execution is extraordinary. Multiple conflicts converge in a single moment, institutional and personal and divine, and the scene has to manage all of these competing pressures simultaneously without losing coherence. The editing intercuts between multiple emotional registers with a fluidity that suggests meticulous planning and rehearsed execution. The performances are calibrated to complement rather than compete with each other, with each actor modulating their energy to create a harmonious whole even as their characters are in conflict. And the direction holds the scene together through blocking that is simultaneously naturalistic and symbolically loaded, with a physical positioning of characters in the frame reflecting their allegiances and their tensions. It is a masterclass in ensemble staging, and it represents the show's ability to deliver spectacle that is rooted in character and meaning rather than in empty visual noise. The aftermath of this convergence point is where the show makes one of its most daring structural choices, and it is the choice that I think will define the audience's experience of the overall narrative. Rather than resolving the conflicts that converged, the show lets them fracture and disperse, sending characters in different directions and forcing Luke to confront the consequences of the confrontation from a position of diminished control. The show is betting that the audience will find this fragmentation more interesting than a clean resolution, and I think the bet pays off because the fragmentation creates narrative space for the kind of character development that resolution forecloses. When everything is resolved, there is nothing left to discover. When everything is fractured, every interaction becomes a negotiation, every choice becomes significant, and every moment of connection becomes precious, because the possibility of loss is always present. The technical quality of the show remains remarkably consistent as it moves into its later territory, and I think this consistency reflects a production philosophy that prioritized planning over improvisation. The visual effects maintain their quality. The sound design continues to innovate. The score evolves without losing its identity. The cinematography takes creative risks that pay off more often than not, and the editing maintains its distinctive rhythm even as the narrative demands become more complex. This is a production that was clearly designed as a whole rather than assembled episode by episode, And the holistic approach pays dividends in the form of a viewing experience that feels cohesive and intentional from beginning to end. And the Academy's philosophy creates a kind of cultural dialogue that enriches the show's thematic range. Luke, who has been shaped by the Academy's framework even as he has rejected its limitations, finds himself in environments where his assumptions are challenged and his categories dissolve. And these experiences contribute to his ongoing development in ways that feel organic and earned. The goddesses' politics, which have been hinted at throughout the early portions of the story, become more explicit as the world expands, and the show reveals a divine landscape that is as complex and as flawed as the mortal one. The goddesses are not united. They have factions, rivalries, historical grievances, and competing visions for the future. And Luke's presence in their world introduces a variable that disrupts carefully balanced power arrangements. The show uses these divine politics to explore themes of legacy, responsibility, and the relationship between power and accountability, and it does so with the same nuance that characterize its handling of the Academy's institutional dynamics. Power, the show consistently argues, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in relationships, in structures, in the ongoing negotiation between those who have it and those who are affected by it. And that negotiation is never simple and never finished. I want to express something that is perhaps more personal than analytical, but I think it is important to the integrity of this review. Watching this show made me feel things that I was not expecting to feel. There are moments in Luke's journey that connected with my own experiences of feeling out of place, of being measured by standards that did not account for who I actually was, of finding strength in connection when I could not find it in myself. The show's emotional specificity, its willingness to portray vulnerability without weakness, to show strength without invincibility, to present love without idealization, created a viewing experience that was not just entertaining but genuinely meaningful. I do not say this to suggest that the show is universally affecting or that everyone will have the same reaction. I say it because I believe in honesty in criticism, and the honest truth is that this show got under my skin in a way that I did not anticipate and that I am still processing. The character arcs in the show's ensemble continue to deliver satisfying development as the story progresses, with characters who were initially defined by single trait revealing unexpected dimensions. The rival who began as an ideological opponent shows flashes of something more complicated, a respect that he cannot quite suppress even as his worldview demands that he reject everything Luke represents. The mentor figure reveals motivations that are more personal than professional, connecting their interest in Luke to experiences in their own past that echo his present. Even minor characters, students and faculty who appear in only a handful of scenes, are given enough specificity to feel like individuals rather than extras. This density of characterization creates a world that feels populated rather than staged, and it rewards attention because you never know when a background detail or a passing comment will later reveal itself as significant. The show's engagement with the concept of identity transformation is perhaps its most philosophically rich thread, and it becomes increasingly central as Luke's bonds multiply and his soul's signature continues to evolve. The question of whether Luke is still the same person he was before the mark, whether identity is continuous or discontinuous, whether the self is a fixed point or a flowing river, is not answered definitively by the show, because the show is wise enough to recognize that it is not a question with a definitive answer. Instead, it presents multiple perspectives on identity through its characters. The institutional view that identity is categorizable and measurable, the divine view that identity is mutable and fluid, and the personal view that identity is whatever you choose to fight for. Luke navigates these perspectives without fully committing to any one of them, and his ongoing negotiation with his own identity is one of the show's most relatable and compelling narrative threads. I am noticing that as I talk about this show, I keep returning to the same fundamental observation. It takes itself seriously. And I want to clarify what I mean by that, because it is not the same as saying it is humorless or self-important. The show has warmth. It has humor. It has moments of genuine playfulness. But it never treats its own world as a joke. It never winks at the audience to signal that it knows the premise is silly. It commits fully to its reality, its characters, and its emotions, and that commitment is what allows it to reach the heights it reaches. A show that was embarrassed by its own genre would never be able to produce the kind of emotional impact that this one consistently delivers. Confidence in one's own story is the prerequisite for everything else, and this show has it in abundance. The way the show handles dramatic irony is worth noting because it uses this tool with restraint and precision. There are moments where the audience knows something that a character does not, and the show deploys these moments not for cheap tension, but for emotional complexity. When you watch a character make a decision based on incomplete information, knowing that they do not have the full picture, the effect is not frustration, but empathy. You understand why they are making the choice they are making, even though you know it might be wrong, because you have been given enough context to see the situation from their perspective. This empathetic use of dramatic irony is a mark of a confident storyteller, one who respects both their characters and their audience, and it is employed throughout this show with consistent skill. The final stretch of material I want to cover before we transition to the broader wrap-up involves the show's treatment of legacy and inheritance. The Forbidden Soul mark has a history, and that history is not abstract. It has shaped the world in concrete ways, influencing the development of the academy, the politics of the goddesses, and the cultural understanding of power. Luke is not just wielding a personal ability. He is inheriting a legacy, and the show takes seriously the weight of that inheritance. There are moments where Luke grapples with the actions of previous mark bearers, where he confronts the possibility that he is destined to repeat their mistakes, where he has to decide whether the legacy he has inherited defines him or whether he can write a different ending. These moments are rich with thematic resonance, connecting Luke's personal journey to larger questions about history, free will, and the possibility of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations. The visual motifs continue to reward attention in the later portions, with recurring images that accumulate meaning as they reappear. Water, which has been a subtle presence throughout the show, becomes more prominent, appearing in reflections, in rain, in the fluidity of the Forbidden Mark's energy, and the show uses it to suggest transformation, adaptation, and the persistence of life in the face of rigid structures. Fire, associated with combat and passion, and the more volatile aspects of Luke's bonds, provides a visual counterpoint to water's fluidity, and the interplay between these elements in the show's visual language creates a dynamic aesthetic that keeps the imagery fresh and resonant even as it repeats. The show's engagement with the concept of home is unexpectedly moving. Luke, who has never truly belonged anywhere, who has been an outsider at the academy, a curiosity to the goddesses, a variable in everyone's calculations, has to figure out where home is. And the show's answer, expressed through narrative rather than statement, is that home is not a place. It is people. It is the network of bonds, the web of relationships, the connections that make you who you are and that you, in turn, shape through your presence. Home, for Luke, is wherever his people are. And the journey to understand that simple but profound truth is one of the show's most quietly powerful narratives. Let me describe one more scene that has stayed with me because I think it illustrates the show's ability to find profundity in simplicity. It is a late scene, after a period of intense conflict and emotional turbulence, and Luke is sitting with his partners in a room. Just sitting. Some of them are talking softly. Some are quiet. There is food on a table, half eaten, and the lighting is warm, the kind of umber glow that suggests late afternoon or early evening. And the camera slowly pans across their faces, each one carrying the evidence of what they have been through together. And there is a quality in that pan that is almost documentary, as if the camera has happened upon a real moment between real people. It is not dramatic. It is not particularly significant in terms of plot. But it is one of the most beautiful moments in the show Because it captures something that the show has been building toward from the very beginning. The experience of being at home with people who have seen you at your worst and chosen to stay. It is a moment of earned peace. And it is more moving than any battle or revelation because it is the thing that all the battles and revelations were in service of. Connection. Belonging. The quiet, extraordinary miracle of being known and loved anyway. The way the show handles its climax when it arrives is characteristically thoughtful. The big confrontation is not just a physical battle. It is a convergence of every thematic thread the show has been weaving. The question of monstrosity, the politics of power, the nature of bonds, the meaning of strength, the possibility of change. The climax asks Luke to be everything he has become, not just powerful but wise, not just strong but compassionate, not just brave but honest. And the show stages the confrontation as a test of character as much as a test of ability. The resolution, when it comes, is not a clean victory. It is messy, costly, and incomplete in the way that real resolutions always are. And the show is brave enough to let you sit with the incompleteness rather than tying everything up in a bow. I think the most telling detail about the show's conclusion is what it chooses to emphasize. After the dust settles, after the big confrontation is resolved, the show does not linger on the victory. It lingers on the aftermath, on the characters processing what happened, on the relationships being renegotiated in the wake of the crisis, on Luke sitting with the knowledge of what the experience has cost and what it has given him. The show understands that the real story is not the climax. It is the life that continues after the climax, and it gives that continuation the same care and attention that it gave the build-up. That is a mark of a show that trusts its characters more than its plot. And it is the final proof, if anyone needed, that this creative team understands what storytelling is for. The emotional resonance of the show's final moments in the first arc is profound without being overwrought. Luke's journey is not complete. The show is clear about that. There are unresolved questions, unfinished arcs, costs that have been incurred but not yet fully paid. But there's also a sense of earned equilibrium, a recognition that Luke has become someone capable of facing whatever comes next, not because he is invincible, but because he is connected, because he has built something worth defending, and has developed the wisdom to know that the building never stops. The show ends its first major arc not with a period, but with a comma, a pause that acknowledges the story so far while promising that there is more to come. And the pause feels like a breath, a moment of rest before the next chapter begins. This show, Monster, Terikat Dengan Devi, is not perfect. No show is. There are moments where the pacing sags, where a scene runs a beat too long or a subplot threatens to lose momentum. There are occasional instances of dialogue that leans too heavily on genre conventions, lines that could have been sharper or more specific. And the harem framework, however thoughtfully executed, will always carry certain limitations that the show cannot entirely transcend. But the cumulative effect of everything the show does well vastly outweighs these imperfections. It is a show that takes risks, that commits to its vision, that respects its characters and its audience, and that delivers an emotional experience that is genuine, specific, and deeply satisfying. If you have been on the fence about watching it, if the premise made you uncertain, if the genre trappings made you cautious, I would encourage you to give it the chance it deserves. Sit with it. Let it breathe. Trust the process. I think you will find, as I did, that beneath the fantastical surface, there is a story about connection, about identity, about the courage it takes to be known, that is as real and as moving as anything you will find on screen this year. And that is just the first arc. The way the show sets up its future narrative territory is confident without being manipulative. There are no cheap cliffhangers, no manufactured mysteries designed solely to drive engagement. The unresolved threads are genuinely unresolved, organic extensions of the story that has been told rather than artificial hooks planted for marketing purposes. The goddess's full agenda remains unclear, but in a way that feels earned rather than coy. The nature of the Forbidden Mark's ultimate purpose is still unknown, but the mystery is built on solid narrative foundations rather than on withheld information. The show trusts that you will return not because it has tricked you into needing answers, but because it has made you care about the people whose stories those answers will affect. That is the difference between a show that hooks you and a show that earns you, and this one has earned every bit of its hold. I find myself thinking about the show's title one final time as I wrap up this first deep dive. Monster? Aku Terikat Dengan Dewi. The question mark. The declaration of binding. The invocation of divinity. Every element of that title has proven to be more complex and more meaningful than it first appeared. And the fact that the show continues to interrogate its own title, continues to find new dimensions in the words it chose to describe itself, is a testament to the depth of its ambition and the quality of its execution. This is not a show that can be reduced to its premise. It is a show that transforms its premise into something richer and stranger and more beautiful than anyone could have expected. And I am genuinely excited to continue this conversation about where it goes from here and what it all means when we look at the complete picture. The ensemble cast continues to impress with the specificity of their work, and I want to give particular recognition to the performances that handle the show's most emotionally demanding material. Acting in a fantasy context requires a particular kind of skill, the ability to ground heightened circumstances in recognizable emotion, and this cast demonstrates that skill consistently. When a character weeps in this show, you believe the tears because the performance has built to them through accumulated detail rather than jumping to them through dramatic shortcut. When a character rages, you feel the heat because the performance has established the control that is being lost. When a character loves, you understand the risk because the performance has shown you the walls that are being lowered. This is acting that respects the intelligence of the audience and the complexity of the material, and it is one of the show's most valuable assets. The show's relationship with its genre is one of its most interesting qualities, and I want to explore that relationship one more time before we move forward. This is, undeniably, a show that operates within the conventions of academy fantasy and harem romance. It uses the tropes of those genres, the ranking system, the power progression, the multiple love interests, the divine hierarchy. But it uses them as raw materials rather than as blueprints. The tropes are starting points, not destinations, and the show consistently subverts expectations not through shocking twists, but through emotional depth. You expect the underdog to rise, and he does, but the rising is painful and costly. You expect the bonds to strengthen the protagonist, and they do, but the strengthening comes with vulnerability and responsibility. You expect the goddesses to be prizes, and they are not, because they are people with their own agency and agendas. The show is in constant dialogue with its genre, honoring its conventions while enriching them, and the result is a work that is both satisfying as genre entertainment and transcendent as storytelling. The craft on display in this show extends to details that most viewers will never consciously notice, and I think that is worth celebrating. The costume department has designed outfits that subtly evolve with the characters, incorporating small changes in color, texture, and silhouette that reflect emotional and narrative development. The props department has created objects that feel like they belong in this world, that have weight and history and cultural significance. The hair and makeup team has developed looks that are thematically resonant without being distracting, that serve character rather than spectacle. All of these behind-the-scenes contributions are invisible in the best possible way, seamlessly integrated into the viewing experience, and they are a testament to the collaborative spirit of a production that clearly values craft at every level. The way the show handles moments of revelation is particularly effective because it understands that the impact of a revelation depends not just on its content, but on its context. A piece of information delivered at the right moment, in the right emotional state, from the right source, can be devastating in a way that the same information delivered carelessly would not be. The show is meticulous about calibrating these moments, about ensuring that the audience is in the right emotional position to receive the information with maximum impact. This calibration requires a deep understanding of narrative pacing, character psychology, and audience engagement, and the show demonstrates all three consistently. I want to close this first portion of our discussion by returning to where we began, with Luke Wayne standing in the middle of Asgard Academy, taking up as little space as possible, absorbing the contempt of people who have already decided what he is worth. Because the distance between that Luke and the Luke who exists at the end of the first arc is enormous. But it is a distance measured in increments, in small moments of courage and connection and choice, and the show has made you feel every single step. You have walked this road with him. You have felt his doubt and his determination and his fear and his love. And you have seen him become not the strongest person in the room, but the most connected, the most honest, the most willing to be seen. That is a journey worth taking. And it is a journey that this show tells with a level of care and craft that elevates it far above its genre peers. But we are not done yet. Not even close. Because the story of Luke Wayne and the goddesses who seek him, the forbidden mark that binds him, and the academy that cannot contain him has depths that we have only begun to explore. And I want to go deeper into the thematic architecture, the character relationships, the performance craft, and the visual storytelling that makes this show something truly special. So let us keep going, because there is so much more to talk about. The midsection of the show's narrative is where the thematic density becomes most apparent, and I think it is worth spending significant time here, because this is where the creative team's ambition is most visible. The show is not content to be a simple power fantasy or a straightforward romance. It is using its genre framework to explore questions about power, identity, connection, and responsibility that are genuinely complex. And the midsection is where all of these thematic threads begin to converge and interact in ways that create new meanings and new questions. The Forbidden Mark's history, the Academy's institutional evolution, the goddess's political calculations, Luke's personal growth, and the deepening of his bonds all begin to influence each other, creating a web of thematic resonance that rewards close attention and thoughtful engagement. Let me go deeper into the relationship dynamics that define the show's emotional landscape, because I think these dynamics are more varied and more nuanced than a surface reading might suggest. Each of Luke's bonds is not just a different flavor of the same basic relationship. Each one represents a different model of connection, a different philosophy of what it means to be bound to another person. And the show explores these models with a curiosity that is more anthropological than romantic. One bond is a partnership of equals who challenge each other to grow. Another is a protector-protected dynamic that is complicated by the protected person's refusal to remain passive. Another is a bond of mutual healing where two wounded people find in each other a safe space to process their pain. And another is a bond of intellectual kinship where the connection is based not on emotional need, but on shared curiosity and a mutual respect for each other's minds. Each of these models is presented as valid and valuable, and the show does not rank them or suggest that one is superior to the others. Love, the show argues, is not one thing. It is a spectrum of practices and philosophies, each with its own strengths and its own challenges, and the richness of a life is measured by the diversity of connections it contains. The way the show portrays the goddess's approach to connection is a fascinating counterpoint to the human-scale relationships that form its emotional core. The goddesses connect differently. Their bonds are political, strategic, generational, shaped by immortality and power and the weight of history. When a goddess reaches out to Luke, it is not the same as a classmate reaching out. The scale is different. The implications are different. The risks are different. And the show uses this difference to explore what happens to the practice of connection when the power differential is extreme. Can a goddess truly connect with a mortal? Can a relationship between unequals ever be fully honest? These questions are not answered definitively, but they are asked with intelligence and sensitivity. And the show's refusal to simplify them is part of what makes it thematically ambitious. The show's treatment of power as a relational rather than individual phenomenon has implications that extend beyond the romantic into the political and the philosophical. In the academy, power is measured individually, and that individual measurement creates a competitive environment where everyone is everyone else's rival. Luke's Forbidden Mark introduces a different model, one where power is shared, where strength comes from coordination rather than domination, and where the whole is genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. The show uses this contrast to make a broader argument about the nature of social organization, suggesting that systems built on competition produce a particular kind of society with particular values and particular blind spots, while systems built on cooperation produce something different, and, the show implies, something better. This argument is not heavy-handed. It is woven into the fabric of the narrative, expressed through character behavior and plot outcomes rather than through speeches and sermons, and its cumulative effect is a show that is quietly but persistently radical in its social philosophy. I want to take a moment to discuss the show's approach to exposition one more time, because I think it is doing something that I have not fully articulated. The show does not just embed its lore in everyday scenes. It embeds it in contradictions. Different characters give different accounts of the same historical events. Different sources present different interpretations of the same magical phenomena. The show presents a world where knowledge is contested, where truth is perspectival, where the narrative of history is always being written by someone with a point of view. This approach to exposition does more than just build the world. It teaches the audience to be skeptical, to question sources, to understand that information in this world, as in ours, is always filtered through an agenda. It is a sophisticated epistemological move, and it gives the show's world-building a depth and a credibility that a more authoritative approach would lack. The editing continues to be one of the show's most distinctive technical elements, and I want to highlight a specific technique that becomes more prominent in the middle and later episodes: the use of match cuts to create thematic parallels between different storylines. A shot of Luke reaching for his partner's hand cuts to a shot of a goddess reaching for a political alliance. A shot of a student training alone cuts to a shot of a faculty member reading alone. These match cuts create visual rhymes that suggest thematic connections between seemingly disparate narrative elements, and they do so without any dialogue or narration to explain the connection. The audience is trusted to make the inferential leap, and the trust is rewarded with a viewing experience that is richer and more layered than a straightforward presentation would allow. The emotional complexity of the show deepens as the relationships mature, and the show is honest about the fact that mature relationships are not always harmonious. There are disagreements between Luke and his partners that are not easily resolved. There are moments of hurt that are not quickly healed. There are gaps in understanding that persist despite genuine effort on both sides. The show presents these difficulties not as failures of the relationships, but as features of them, natural and inevitable consequences of bringing to complex, imperfect people into close proximity and asking them to build something together. This honest portrayal of relationship difficulty is one of the show's most valuable contributions to its genre, which too often presents love as a destination rather than a practice, as a feeling rather than a discipline. The show's engagement with the concept of destiny is nuanced and avoids the traps that this theme often falls into in fantasy narratives. Luke is not destined. He is not the chosen one in any traditional sense. The forbidden mark happened to him through a combination of circumstance and choice, and his development from that point is the product of his decisions and the support of his partners rather than the fulfillment of a prophecy. The show is clear about this, and the clarity is important because it preserves Luke's agency. If he were destined to become powerful, his growth would be predetermined and therefore meaningless. By grounding his development in choice and relationship, the show ensures that every step of his journey carries the weight of possibility, the understanding that things could have gone differently, and the appreciation for the specific, contingent, unrepeatable path that they actually took. There's a particular scene in the middle section of the show that I want to describe in detail because it represents everything I love about this show's approach to drama. Luke has discovered something about the history of the forbidden mark that challenges his understanding of his own power. He is conflicted, uncertain, and he brings this information to one of his partners, not for advice, but for witness. He needs someone to see him in this moment of doubt, to hold the space for his confusion without trying to fix it. And the scene that follows is one of the most beautiful depictions of emotional support I have ever seen on screen. His partner does not offer solutions. She does not minimize his fear. She does not promise that everything will be fine. She sits with him. She listens. She asks questions that help him articulate what he is feeling, not because she needs the information, but because she knows that articulation is itself a form of processing. And when the conversation reaches its natural end, she does not wrap it up with a bow. She simply stays, present, connected, unmoving. It is a scene that should be required viewing for anyone who wants to understand what emotional support actually looks like. And it is a testament to the show's commitment to portraying relationships as they are rather than as we wish they were. The show's use of weather and environmental conditions as emotional metaphors is consistent without being heavy-handed. Rain accompanies moments of emotional release. Still air accompanies moments of tension. Wind accompanies moments of change. These environmental choices are subtle enough to feel natural, but consistent enough to create a pattern that reinforces the show's emotional landscape. The production design team has clearly coordinated with the writing team to ensure that the physical environment of each scene supports its emotional content, and the result is a viewing experience where the world itself seems to be responding to the characters' inner states. The performances in the show's more intimate scenes deserve particular praise because they require a level of trust and vulnerability that is difficult to achieve. When two characters are alone, when the dialogue strips away the social masks and the institutional politics and the power dynamics, what remains is raw human connection. And the actors in these scenes are operating at a level of emotional honesty that feels almost uncomfortably real. There is a scene where Luke and one of his partners discuss their fears about the future, and the conversation is so quiet, so specific, so grounded in the particular details of their particular situation that it feels less like fiction and more like eavesdropping. That level of realism in a fantasy context is rare and precious, and it is one of the show's most impressive achievements. So friends, that's for today. I hope you like this video. If you like this video, please subscribe my channel.